from page 180 onwards. So I want you to bear with me for a moment until I get my mobile ready. We'll start right away. Page 180. These he has reserved for special sections at the beginning or end of his chapters. Chaverness, however, concludes from this contrast between what he characterizes as the traditional narrative style of the Han, simple, concise, cold, and impassive, and the emotional and personal quality of Qian's own expression. Sorry, Qian's Qian's own expressions of opinion that the narrative sections must not have been original with Qian but were copied directly from earlier sources. This conclusion seems to me hardly justifiable. Let me just increase the volume. Okay. The treatise, the treatises on the Feng and Shan sacrifices, volume 28, or the River and Canals, volume 29, or the biographies of Li Kuan, volume 109, Suma Xiangju, volume 117, or Kuo Xie, volume 124, for example, are all in this simple, impassive style. Yet it is hard to conceive that complete treatises and biographies on these subjects could possibly have existed for Qian to copy from. Any modern historian is allowed to have two styles. One when he gives a simple, direct account of historical facts, another when he ventures upon his own reactions and opinions. I see no reason to believe that Qian was not equally capable of composing in two styles. The fact that he kept the two strictly apart, to a degree unknown in Western historical writing, was due to the dictates of Chinese custom, which demanded such a separation. Often, as I have pointed out, Qian utilized the words of one of his characters, or a poem or song, when he wished to convey emotion in the body of his narrative. Occasionally, just as the close of his narrative, he indulges in a few sentences of personal comment to sum up his feelings on the subject. At the end of his description of the endless humbug which surrounded the great sacrifices of Feng and Shan and the pathetic efforts of Emperor Wu to achieve immortality, for example, he concludes, the Son of Heaven grew increasingly weary and disgusted with the queer and inane tales of the magicians, and yet he was bound and tied by them and could not free himself, for always he hoped to find the truth. Volume 28 upon 88. This brief description of the deluded ruler, this brief description of the deluded ruler, the prey of every clever charlatan, which Panku in his treatise on the same subject, HS25, partially omits, gains its emotional power precisely because it comes at the end of a completely impersonal recital of the facts. Most of Qian's remarks are confined to the special sections set off by the words, the grand historian says. These passages are personal and emotional in the extreme. Over and over he says, I have seen, I have heard, when I visited, when I read, etc. Repeatedly, he speaks of himself as imagining, weeping, sighing, or uses the word pay, I am moved, or it is pitiful. Indeed, Qian is so emotional and personal in these sections that he is quite untypical of Chinese historians. A brief glance at the corresponding sections of the Hanshu will reveal the contrast between Qian and Panku on this point. Panku occasionally quotes the opinions and experiences of Qian or his own father, Pan Piao, but he never once uses the pronoun I in his writing, even when he is clearly speaking in the first person. Never does he give any indication that he has been to the places he mentions or met any of the descendants or associates of the men he describes. Scarcely ever does he intimate that history is for him anything more than a collection of written materials. Sometimes he allows himself an expression of sympathy, usually in good Confucian style, for the plight of the common people. Yet, compared to Suma Qian, he seems almost glacial in his restraint. This is sorry, this truly impersonal style of Panko was followed by later historians, perhaps because the passionate concern of Qian for his subject was inimitable. It is more reassuring to the reader, undoubtedly, to believe that his author is going about the task of relating the facts of history objectively and free of personal emotional involvement. But the loss of interest and literary effectiveness, as we can see when we compare the pages of the Shichi and the Hanshu, is great indeed. Judgments upon the style and emotional impact of writing, especially when the writing is in a foreign language, are highly personal and hardly subject to scientific proof. Chauvinist can harshly be denied his right to remark that the narrative of the Shichi strikes him for the most part as cold and impersonal. I should only like to note in conclusion that other readers may hold and often have held quite different opinions. I quote, for example, a comment on the Shichi by another foreigner, the Japanese historian Rai Sanyo, 1780 to 1832. Quote, I delight in reading the Shichi and always have a few volumes of it on my desk. I read it and sigh, I break into song, I weep or I laugh. Ah, the men of his day looked upon Su Chang's work as so much trash. How little they realized that 100 generations later, there would be men who, reading it, would sigh or sing, weep and laugh. End of the quote. So, there we end the chapter, The Art of Suma Qian or Suma Qian. Okay, so now introduction has ended at page 182. Then we go into some selections of Suma Qian's writings. Watson translated bits and pieces. So we'll be reading that for another 100 pages, and then we'll see. Guys, we are now entering the really interesting part where we are going to be treated to translations from the Qian. We are going to listen directly to Sima Qian. Okay, let's see. This should be the most interesting part. Of course, because it's Chinese prose and that too around 2200 years old, most parts might be obscure. I don't think I might be able to understand at least 50. It'll be great if I can understand at least 50% of it. I think we can understand even less of it. So please bear with me as I read some extracts from some selected translations from the Shi Appendix A, page 183. The following passages contain some of the more important remarks and discussions of Sima Qian. They have been selected to represent his concept of history and the past, the ideals and methods that guided him in his work, and the personal quality of his writing. Most of these key passages have already been discussed or referred to in the chapters above. This selection does not pretend to encompass all the important passages of the Shichi, but only those that seem to me to relate most directly to the life, methods, and opinions of the historian. Volume 1, upon 65 to 67, Basic Annals of the Five Emperors. The grand historian remarks, for centuries scholars have often spoken of the five emperors. Yet the book of documents records only Emperor Yao and his successors, while when the various schools of philosophers tell of the Yellow Emperor, their words are not authoritative and reasonable, so that learned men find it difficult to accept them. Thus, the question of Tsai Yu on the virtues of the five emperors and the successions and clans of the emperors, which Confucius has transmitted to us, are not taught by some Confucian scholars. I myself have traveled west as far as Kungtung, north past Cholu, east to the sea, and in the south I have sailed the Yellow and Huai rivers. The elders and old men of these various lands frequently pointed out to me the places where the Yellow Emperor, Yao, and Shun had lived, and in these places the manners and customs seemed quite different. In general, those of their accounts which do not differ from the ancient texts seem to be near to truth. I have examined the spring and autumn and the narratives from the states, and these show clearly that the virtues of the five emperors and the successions and clans of the emperors are genuine. However, many scholars fail to study the matter deeply enough and cannot see that what appears in these texts is not false. The ancient books are often incomplete and have gaps, but what has been lost from them can sometimes be found in other records. It is indeed difficult to explain such things to men of shallow views and scant knowledge who are not fond of study or deep reflection and whose minds cannot recognize the true significance of things. I have brought together these records and put them in order, selecting those parts which seemed most reasonable and reliable, composing this basic annals as the beginning of my book. Volume 13 upon 3 to 4, preface to the chronological table of the three dynasties. The grand historian remarks, the chronicles of the five emperors and the three dynasties extend back to high antiquity. For the Yin dynasty and before, we cannot compile any genealogical records of the feudal lords, though from the Chow on down they can usually be constructed. When Confucius arranged the spring and autumn annals from the from the old historical texts, he noted the first year of a reign, the time when the year began, and the day and month for each entry. Such was his exactitude. However, when he wrote his prefaces to the Book of Documents, he made only general references and did not mention year and month. Perhaps he had some material, but in many cases there were gaps and it was impossible to record exactly. Therefore, when there was a question of doubt, he recorded it as doubtful. Such was his circumspection. I have read the genealogical records, which have complete dates entered from the Yellow Emperor on down. I have examined these chronologies and genealogies as well as the record of the cycle of the five elements. But these ancient texts disagree and contradict each other throughout. I can hardly consider as meaningless the example of the Master in not attempting to assign the exact year and month to events. Thus, basing my work on the virtues of the five emperors, the successions and clans of the emperors, and the book of documents, I have made this chronological table of the generations from the Yellow Emperor down to the era Kung Ho, 841 BC. Volume 15 upon 2 to 6, Preface to the chronological table of the six states. This table, arranged by year, lists in parallel columns, one below the other, the histories of the states of Chao, Qin, Wei, Han, Chao, Chu, Yan, and Qi for the years from 475 to 206 BC. Chao, representing the central court, is not counted among the six states, nor is Qin, the state which eventually conquered and swallowed up the six. Hence the title, Table of the Six States. Reading the Chronicle of Qin, I come to the time when the Xuan Zhuang barbarians defeated King Yu and Shao moved east to the city of Lo. At this time, Duke Xiang of Qin was first involved among the feudal lords and constructed the altar of the west, using it to serve the Lord on high. Here is the first sign of usurpation. The ritual says, quote, "The Son of Heaven shall sacrifice to heaven and earth. The feudal lords shall sacrifice to the famous mountains and great rivers within their domains." End of quote. At this time, Qin followed many of the customs of the barbarians, putting violence first and disregarding benevolence and righteousness. It held the position of an enfeoffed subject, and yet it imitated the suburban sacrifice of the Son of Heaven. Such behavior is enough to fill a gentleman with fear. Then I come to Duke Wen, who advanced out of Lung and drove back the I and T barbarians. He worshipped the treasures of Chen and made his camp between Qi and Yung. Then Duke Mu applied himself to the task of governing and extended the state east to the Yellow River, standing as an equal with Duke Huan of Qi and Duke Wen of Qin as a leader of the peers of the Middle Kingdom. After this, the ministers of the feudal lords took over the management of their respective governments. The high officials handed their offices down from generation to generation, and the six lords of Qin seized power in their state, conducting military campaigns and forming alliances until their authority outweighed that of the feudal lords. Eventually, when Tian Chang assassinated Duke Xian and became Prime Minister of the state of Qi, the feudal lords simply sat back and made no move to punish him. So busy was everyone within the four seas in struggling for his own military success. In the end, the three states divided up Qin among themselves, and Tian Ho overthrew and took possession of Qi. This was the beginning of the great period of the six states. All worked to strengthen their arms and encompass their enemies. Plots and deceptions were employed, and the strategies of the vertical and horizontal, the short and long alliances appeared. The land swarmed with false titles and oaths, and agreements could not be trusted. Although men exchanged hostages and split tallies, they still could not enforce promises. Qin was originally only a small state in a distant and out of the way place, rejected by the feudal lords of the Middle Kingdom and regarded the same as the barbarians. But after the time of Duke Xian, it was always one of the leaders of the feudal lords. The best Qin had in the way of virtue and honor could not compare even with the worst in violence and cruelty of Lu or Wei. In arms, it could not weigh up to the strength of the three states of Qin. And yet, in the end, it conquered the world. This was not necessarily because of the advantages of steep and secure terrain or the result of fortunate circumstances. Rather, it was as though heaven had aided it. Some say things begin life in the east and come to maturity in the west. Thus, one must begin his dynastic undertaking in the southeast, and he will always reap his success in the northwest. Therefore, we find that Emperor Yu arose among the western Qian, Tang began in Po, the Chao attained kingship by attacking the Yin from Fengkao, Qin became emperor by rising in Yongzhou, and the ascendancy of the Han was from the lands of Shu and Han. When Qin had already accomplished its aims, it burned all copies of the odes and documents, and in particular the historical records of the feudal laws, because they contained criticisms and slander of the Qin. The reason the odes and documents reappeared is because a number of copies were stored with private families, but the historical records were preserved only in the archives of Chao, and so they were lost. What a pity! What a pity! We have only the annals of Qin, and it does not even record days and months. Its text is brief and incomplete. Yet, yet there is much that can be learned from the methods and stratagems for gaining power used by the warring states. Why must one learn only from ancient times? There was much violence in Qin's seizure of the world, but because it was able to change with each different age, its success was great. There is a book which says, "Take for your model the king of later ages." Why is this? Because they are near to us and their ways and customs are like ours. Their counsels are easy and simple to practice. Scholars are misled by tradition and see only that the time the Qin held the position of emperor was very short without examining the end and beginning of the affair. Therefore, they all mock the Qin and do not begin de- and do not deign to speak to of sorry and do not deign to speak of it. This is no different from trying to eat with your ears, and a form of nonsense I find very regrettable. Thus, I have followed the annals of Qin and made a continuation from the end of the spring and autumn period, beginning with King Yuan of Chao and recording the dates and events of the six states, down to the second emperor of the Qin in all a period of 270 years. I have recorded all that I have heard of the beginning of ascendancy and decay. In later years, there may be gentlemen who will read what I have done. Volume 44 upon 50. The Hereditary House of Wei. The Grand Historian remarks, I have visited the ruins of the old city of Daliang. The people around the place told me that when Qin overthrew Liang, it dug canals from the Yellow River and flooded Daliang. In 3 months, the city walls collapsed and the king begged to surrender. Thus, Wei was eventually destroyed. The strategists all say that it was because Wei did not make use of the Lord of Xingling that the state became so feeble and was finally wiped out. But I consider that this is not correct. Heaven at this time had commanded Qin to pacify all within the seas, and its task was not yet completed. Although Wei might have had the services of an Aheng, of what use would it have been? Volume 61. The Biography of Po I and Shu Qi. Although in the world of learning there exist a large number and variety of books and records, their reliability must always be examined in the light of the six classics. In spite of deficiencies in the classics of the odes and documents, we can nevertheless know something about the culture and institutions of the times of Yu, Emperor Shun, and Xia dynasty. When, for instance, Emperor Yao wished to retire from his position, he yielded the throne to Shun of Yu. When Shun in turn yielded to Yu, the various court officials made their recommendations in favor of Yu, and he was given the throne for a period of trial. After he had discharged the duties of the imperial office for some 20 years and his merits and ability were already manifest, only then was the rule finally ceded to him. This proves that the empire is a precious vessel, the heritage of the ruler, and that its transmission is a matter of extreme gravity. Yet there are some theorists who say that Yao tried to yield the empire to Su Yu and that Su Yu was ashamed and would not accept it but fled into retirement. Again, in the time of the Xia dynasty, we have similar stories of men called p180 and Wu Kuang. Where do people get stories like this? The grand historian remarks, when I ascended Mount Qi, I found at the top what is said to be the grave of Su Yu. Confucius, we know, eulogizes the ancient sages and men of wisdom and virtue, and quite specifically mentions such figures as Tai Po of Wu and Po Ai. Now I am told that Su Yu and Wu Kuang were men of the highest virtue, and yet in the classics there appears not the slightest reference to them. Why would this be? Confucius said, Po Ai and Shu Qi never bore old ills in mind and had not the faintest feelings of rancor. Quote, they sought to act virtuously and they did so. What was there for them to repine about? End of quote. I am greatly moved by the determination of Po Ai, but when I examine the song that has been attributed to him, I find it very strange. The tales of these men state that Po Ai and Shu Qi were two sons of the ruler of Kuchu. Their father wished to set up Shu Qi as his heir, but when he died, Shu Qi yielded in favor of Po Ai. Po Ai replied that it had been their father's wish that Shu Qi should inherit the throne, and so he departed from the kingdom. Shu Qi, likewise, being unwilling to accept the rule, went away, and the people of the kingdom set up his second son as ruler. At this time, Po Ai and Shu Qi heard that Chang, the chief of the West, knew well how to look after the old, and they said, why should we not go and follow him? But when they had gone, they found that the chief of the West was dead, and his son King Wu had taken up the ancestral tablets of his father, whom he honored with the title of King Wen, and was marching east to attack Emperor Chou of the Yin. Po Ai and Shu Qi clutched the reins of Kung Wu's horse and reprimanded him, saying, quote, the mourning for your father is not yet completed, and yet you take up shield and spear. Can this conduct be called filial? As a subject, you seek to assassinate your lord. Is this what is called righteousness? End of quote. The king's attendants wished to strike them down, but the king's counselor, Tai Kung, interposed, saying, these are just men, and he sent them away unharmed. After this, King Wu conquered and pacified the people of the Yin, and the world honored the house of Chou as its ruler. But Po Ai and Shu Qi were filled with shame and outrage and considered it unrighteous to eat the grain of Chou. They fled and hid on Shaoyang mountain, where they tried to live by gathering ferns to eat. When they were on the point of starvation, they composed a song. Quote, song. We ascend this western hill and pluck its ferns. He replaces violence with violence and sees not his own fault. Shen Nung, Yu and Xia, how long ago these great men vanished? Whom now should we follow? Alas, let us depart, for our fate has run out. End of quote. They died of starvation on Shaoyang mountain. When we examine this song, do we find any rancor or not? Some people say quote, it is heaven's way without distinction of persons to keep the good perpetually supplied. End of quote. Can we say then that Po Ai and Shu Qi were good men or not? They clung to righteousness and were pure in their deeds, as we have seen, and yet they starved to death. Oh, is he here criticizing belief in heaven? Of his 70 disciples, Confucius singled out Yan Hui for praise because of his diligence in learning, yet Yan Hui was often in want, never getting his fill of even the poorest food, and suffered an untimely death. In this the way is this the way heaven rewards the good man? Robber Chi day after day killed innocent men, making mincemeat of their flesh. Cruel and willful, he gathered a band of several thousand followers who went about terrorizing the world. But in the end, he lived to a great old age. For what virtue did he deserve this? The import of these examples is perfectly apparent. Even in more recent times, we see that men whose deeds are immoral and who constantly violate the laws and prohibitions end their lives in luxury and wealth, and their blessings pass down to their heirs without end. And there are others who sorry, and there are others who carefully choose the spot where they shall place each footstep, who speak out only when it is time to speak, who walk on no bypaths and expend no anger on what is not upright and just, and yet, in numbers too great to be reckoned, they meet with misfortune and disaster. I find myself in much perplexity. Is this so called way of heaven right or wrong? Confucius said, quote, "Those whose ways are different cannot lay plans for one another." End of quote. Each will follow his own will. Therefore, he said, quote, "If the search for riches and honor were sure to be successful, though I should become a groom with whip in hand to get them, I would do so. But as the search might not be successful, I will follow after that which I love." End of quote. Quote, "When the year becomes cold, then we know how the pine and the cypress are the last to lose their leaves." End of quote. When the whole world is in foul and muddy confusion, then is the man of true purity seen. Then must one judge what he will consider important, what unimportant. The superior man hates the thought of his name not being mentioned after his death. As Chia has said, quote, "The covetous run after riches, the impatient pursue a fair name, the proud die struggling for power, and the people long only to live." End quote. Quote, "Things of the same light illumine each other. Things of the same class seek each other out. Clouds pursue the dragon, the wind follows the tiger, the sage arises and all creation becomes clear." End of quote. Po I and Shu Qi, although they were men of great virtue, became, through Confucius, even more illustrious in fame. Though Yan Hui was diligent in learning, like a fly riding on the tail of a swift horse, his attachment to Confucius made his deeds renowned. The hermit scholars, hiding away in their caves, may be ever so correct in their givings and takings, and yet the names of them and their kind vanish like smoke without receiving a word of praise. Is this not pitiful? People of humble origin living in the village lanes strive to make perfect their actions and establish a name for virtue, but if they do not somehow ally themselves with a man of worth and importance, how can they hope that their fame will be handed down to posterity? Volume 66 upon 23. The biography of Wu Tzu Shu. Wu Zhu Shu's father, an official of Chu, fell victim to the slander of court rivals and was seized and held as a hostage. Word was sent to his two sons, Zhu Shu and Shang, that if they would come and surrender themselves, they might save their father. Shang, for the sake of filial piety, went, although he knew he would be put to death. But Zhu Shu fled to the state of Wu, where he eventually won favor, led an army against Chu, and avenged the death of his father and brother. The grand historian remarks, "How serious a thing is the poison of hatred in men. If a ruler must not arouse hatred among his ministers and subjects, how much more important that he do not do so among his equals." If Wu Tzu had followed his father, She, and died with him, he would have been of no more significance than a mere ant. But he set aside a small righteousness in order to wipe out a great shame, and his name has been handed down to the ages after. How moving! At that time, Su suffered affliction at the river and begged for his food by the roadside, but not for a moment in his determination did he forget Ying. He bore all secretly and silently, and in the end achieved merit and fame. Who but a man of burning intention could have accomplished such a deed? Volume 67 upon 53. Biographies of the Disciples of Confucius. The grand historian remarks, scholars have often spoken about the 70 disciples of Confucius. Those who wished to praise them have sometimes exaggerated the facts, while those interested in disparaging them have done injury to the truth. Both groups alike discuss the matter without ever having known the men they are talking about. There is a register of the disciples preserved by the Kung family and written in archaic characters, which I believe to be generally accurate. I have used this list of names and surnames of the disciples, combining with it the questions and answers of these men found in the Analects, and arranged the material in this chapter. Material that seemed doubtful I have omitted. Volume 69 upon 62. Biography of Su Qian. Su Qian was a famous strategist and diplomat of the Warring States period and the proponent of the Vertical Alliance, a sort of security pact among six feudal states designed to block the expansion of the state of Qin. He was eventually assassinated because of his secret and devious plotting among the various states. After his death, his brothers carried on his campaign for the Vertical Alliance. The grand historian remarks, Su Qin and his two brothers all achieved fame among the feudal lords as itinerant strategists. Their policies laid great stress upon stratagems and shifts of power. But because Su Qin died a traitor's death, the world has united in scoffing at him and has been loath to study his policies. There are a great many varying stories told about Su Qin. Indeed, even affairs that occurred in a different age, if they are of the same type, are all attributed to the figure of Su Qin. Su Qin arose from the humblest beginnings to lead the six states in the vertical alliance, and this is evidence that he possessed an intelligence surpassing the ordinary person. For this reason, I have set forth this account of his deeds, arranging them in proper chronological order, so that he may not forever suffer from an evil reputation and be known for nothing else. Volume 86 upon 39 to 40 Biographies of the Assassin Retainers. This chapter relates the lives of five retainers who undertook to assassinate the enemies of their lords. The most famous of them is for Qin Ko, who, for Crown Prince Tan of Yen, attempted to stab to death King Cheng of Qin, who later became the first emperor of the Qin dynasty. The grand historian remarks, when people these days tell the story of Qin Ko, they assert that at the command of Crown Prince Tan, the heavens rained grain and horses grew horns. This is, of course, a gross error. They likewise say that Qin Ko actually wounded the king of Qin, which is equally untrue. At one time, Kung Sun Chi Kung and Master Tung were friends of Xia Wu Chu, and they learned exactly what happened. I have therefore reported everything just as they told it to me. Of these five men, from Cao Mo to Qin Ko, some succeeded in carrying out their duty and some did not. But it is perfectly clear that they had all determined upon the deed. They were not false to their intentions. Is it not right then that their names should be handed down to later ages? Volume 88 upon 11. Biography of Meng Tian. Meng Tian and his brother Meng Ai were powerful military leaders at the court of the first emperor of Qin, but were later forced to commit suicide by the eunuch Chao Kao. Both protested their innocence of any wrongdoing, but Meng Tian, when he found it was of no avail, consoled himself by saying that he deserved death for the crime of disturbing the arteries of the earth when he constructed the walls and roads for the northern part of the empire. The grand historian remarks, I have traveled to the northern border and returned by the direct route. As I went along, I saw the towers of the great wall which Meng Tian constructed for the Qin. He cut through the mountains and filled up the valleys, opening up a direct road. Truly, he made free with the strength of the common people. Qin had only recently destroyed the feudal states. The hearts of the people of the world were not yet at rest, and the wounded were not yet healed. Tian was a renowned general, yet he did not take this opportunity to urge that the ills of the common people be attended to, that the old be cared for, or the orphan preserved. He did not strive to bring about the well being of the mass of people. Instead, he toadied to the will of the emperor in undertaking these constructions. Was it not right that for this he and his brother met with punishment? What is this crime of the arteries of the earth? Oh, so some generals were punished for constructing Great Wall. Biographies of Chi Pu and Luan Pu, Volume 100 upon 11 to 12. Chi Pu, who fought with Xiang Yu against the Han, was forced into hiding when Xiang Yu was defeated and a price put on his head. In order to escape capture, he allowed himself to be chained and sold as a field slave. He was later pardoned by Cao Tzu and became an official. Luan Pu had been a friend of King of Liang, Peng Yue, in his poorer days. When Peng Yue was accused of treason and executed by Cao Tzu, Luan Pu dared to defy the emperor's orders by weeping and praying before the severed head of Peng Yue that hung exposed in the marketplace of Loyang. He was seized and condemned to die by boiling, but was pardoned at the last minute for his faithfulness and bravery and later rose to high position. The grand historian remarks, with a spirit like that of Xiang Yu, Chi Pu made a name for bravery in Chu. From time to time he commanded armies and several times he seized the enemy penance. He may truly be called a brave and fine man, yet he suffered punishment and disgrace and became a slave and did not commit suicide. Why did he stoop to this? Because he chose to rely upon his abilities. Therefore, he suffered disgrace without shame, for there were things he hoped to accomplish, and he was not yet satisfied. Thus, in the end, he became a renowned general of the Han. Truly, the wise man regards death as a grave thing. When slaves and scullion maids and lowly people in their despair commit suicide, it is not because they are brave. It is because they know that their plans and hopes will never again have a chance of coming true. What? Truly wise man when slaves and scullion maids. Oh. Luan Pu wept for Peng Yue and faced the boiling water as though it were his true destination. This is indeed what it means to know the right place to die, not counting death as important in itself. The most brave and determined men of ancient times could do no better than these two. Volume 123 upon 43 to 46, Memoirs on Ta Yuan. In 138 BC, an envoy, Shang Qian, was sent on a diplomatic mission as far as western Turkestan. The information he brought back with him from his travels changed the whole Chinese conception of the geography of the lands to the west of them. Sima Qian used this account as the basis for this chapter on Ferghana, type called by the Chinese Ta Yuan and the other countries of Central Asia. The grand historian remarks, the basic annals of Emperor Yu records that the basic annals of Emperor Yu records that the source of the Yellow River is in the Kunlun mountains some 2500 li high, the place where the sun and moon in turn go to hide when they are not shining. It is said that on their heights are to be found the fountain of sweet water and the pool of jade. Now Changxian has been sent beyond the land of Taxia, Bactria, tracing the Yellow River to its source, and he found no such Kunlun mountains as the basic annals records. Therefore, what the book of documents states about the mountains and rivers of the 9 provinces of China is nearer the truth. while when it comes to the wonders mentioned in the basic annals of Emperor Yu or the classic of hills and seas, I cannot accept them. Okay, end of Appendix A, page 193. We go to Appendix B. Okay, this seems to be basically a commentary on the dating of Sima Qian's letter to Jen An. There are at present two theories on the dating of Sima Qian's famous letter written to his friend Jen An Zhu Shaoqing, the text of which is found in Han Shu 62 and Wen Xuan 41. I should like here to examine in some detail these theories and the evidence upon which they are based. In the beginning of his letter, Sima Qian thanks Jen An for a letter which he received from his friend some time before, explaining why he has been so long in answering it. He then says, "Now, Sha Qing, you are accused of this terrible crime. The days and months have gone by and it is drawing close to the end of winter. Literally, the third month of winter, the 12th month of the Han year." In a note on this, Liu Chen Chu Wen Xuan, chapter 41 upon 11b, the Tang commentator Lu Xiang says, Anne was a prisoner in jail because of the affair of the Crown Prince Li. Although Lu Xiang does not elaborate upon this statement, his note indicates that he believes that the crime Jen An was accused of was that of aiding the crown prince in his attempted rebellion in Cheng Ho 291 BC, so that the letter must have been written near the end of that year. This is the theory adapted by Chao Shaochang in his Han Shu Chu Xiao Pu, chapter 41 upon 7b. He gives as further proof the fact that Sima Qian states immediately afterwards, "I am forced to go in attendance upon the emperor to Yung in the first month of Cheng Ho 390 BC, according to HS 6 upon 37a, the emperor did in fact go to Yung, and this is the trip according to Chao Shaochang to which Sima Qian is referring. At first glance, this theory seems to fit the facts very well. But let us examine in detail exactly what happened in 91 BC. The biography of Jen An and his friend Tian Zhen was written by Chu Shaosum and appended to the end of chapter 104. According to this account, both Jen An and Tian Zhen were retainers of the famous general Wei Xing and later were promoted by the emperor to official positions. Jen An was made protector of the northern garrison, one of the two garrisons which guarded the city of Chang'an, and some time after was transferred to the position of regional inspector Zhuqi of Ai province in Szechuan. Later, he seems to have been transferred back to his original post, for in 91 BC he was acting as superintendent of the northern garrison. In the summer of 91 BC, the emperor went to his palace at Kanchuan, some 200 li northwest of the capital, to escape the heat. At this time, the crown prince Li and his mother, Empress Wei, became involved in the famous black magic affair and were accused of trying to kill the emperor by means of secret arts. In the early part of the 7th month, the palace of the crown prince was searched for evidence of the crime, and at this time the emperor returned from Kanchuan to the Chiang Chang palace in Shangan. On the day Gen Wu of this month, September 1 by the Western calendar, the prince announced that Xiang Shung, the official who was in charge of the investigation into his conduct, had revolted, using this as an excuse to send out troops to massacre Xiang Shung and his party. He forged credentials, opened the prisons, and attempted to take over the capital by force. One of his acts was to march to the south gate of the northern garrison, summon Jen An, who was in command, give him the false credentials, and demand that Jen An dispatch troops to aid him. Jen An accepted the credentials but shut the gate of the garrison and would not send out any troops, upon which the prince withdrew. In the meantime, the Lieutenant Chancellor Liu Chu-li, with a force of loyal troops, attacked the prince and after 5 days of bloody battle defeated him. On the day King Yen of the 7th month, September 9, the prince managed to escape from the city and flee. Jen An's friend Tian Zhen, Director of Justice, was held responsible for allowing the prince to slip through the city gates. The imperial secretary Pao Shengqi interceded for Tianjin, asking that he be given a hearing, but the emperor was in a rage and would not think of ordinary legal procedure. Pao Shengqi committed suicide in fear, and Tianjin was cut in two at the waist. Things moved very rapidly at this time. What had happened to Jen An in the meantime? According to Chu Shaosun's account in volume 104, the emperor at first believed in the loyalty of Jen An, but a subordinate who had been beaten and humiliated by Jen An sent a memorial to the emperor declaring that Jen An had agreed to help the prince. The emperor thereupon said, "This man is an old official. When he saw the rebellion break out, he wanted to sit by and see which side would win and then go along with the winner. He is double hearted and has committed a great many crimes." Uh, if Anne is double hearted, what is NCBN? He sat around seeing which side would win in the Andhra Telangana war. Goodness. Anne has committed a great many crimes worthy of death, but I have always let him live. Now he has acted fraudulently and is not loyal in his heart. End of quote. The emperor then had Jen An sent to jail and executed. Oh. The question arises of just when this execution took place. We have no way of telling for certain. In HS 6 upon 37a, Pan Ku records the execution of Tianjin between the time of the rebellion and the suicide of the crown prince on the day Sinhai of the 8th month, September 30, but he does not mention the execution of Jen An. In HS 66 upon 4a, however, he says that Jen An was accused of being disloyal because he accepted the credentials of the prince and that both he and Tianjin were cut in two. He relates this before he mentions the suicide of the crown prince, so it would appear that he believed Jen An was executed about the same time as Tianjin, that is between September 1 and September 30. This, of course, is not positive proof of the death date of Jen An. The fact that, according to Chu Shaosun, the emperor became suspicious of Jen An only after receiving a report from An's subordinate would suggest a delay in time. But in view of the general hysteria of the times and the emperor's rage, it seems hard to believe that the affair was still unsettled and that Jen An could have been in jail and alive by the 11th of 12th month of the year when Sima Qian is supposed to have written him. There is one more fact that makes Chao Shou Chang's theory seem improbable. When Sima Qian apologizes for not answering Jen An's letter sooner, he says, "At that time I had to accompany the emperor on a trip to the east." But the emperor did not go to the east either in 91 BC nor in the previous year 92 BC. He was around Shangan the whole time. The last time the emperor had been to the east was in 93 BC. Sima Qian would hardly use this trip as an excuse for not writing if he had been back in Shangan for 2 years before answering Jen An's letter at the end of 91 BC. Chauvinist accepts the theory that Sima Qian's letter was written when Jen An was in prison on charges of having aided the crown prince in 91 BC, but adds a new interpretation of his own. In the introduction to his Memoires Historiques, page XLIII, that is 43, I think, if I'm not wrong. He says that Jen An wrote to Sima Qian asking for Qian's help in getting him set free. But this would mean that Jen An must have written to Sima Qian sometime after the rebellion in the 7th month of 91 BC. In such a case, Sima Qian could not possibly say that he had been busy attending the emperor on a trip to the east. Nor does the tone of Qian's letter suggest that it could have been written when things were as upset as they were in late 91 BC. Finally, Qian's reply suggests that the letter from Jan An was not a plea for personal intercession on his behalf, but a general suggestion that Qian should use his influence at court in helping the advancement of deserving men. Qian refers to Jen An's advice only at the beginning and end of his letter, devoting all the rest of his space to his own troubles. It is worth noting that neither Yan Shi Ku, in his notes on the Hanshu text of the letter, nor any of the other commentators on the Wen Xuan suggest that the crime of Jen An mentioned in Qian's letter refers to the affair of the crown prince. Pan Ku, in his biography of Sima Qian, says Jen An, an old friend who was regional inspector of I province, sent Qian a letter. End of quote. But as we have seen, in 91 BC, Jen An was not the regional inspector of I province, but the superintendent of Shi Che of the northern garrison. So it seems that Pan Ku believed the letter had been written at an earlier time when Jen An was still regional inspector. The second theory on the dating of Qian's letter is that of Wang Kuo Wei, advanced in his study of the life of Sima Qian, opposite under the date Tai Shi 4. He places the letter in the 11th month of Tai Shi 493 BC. This year, he notes, fits perfectly with Qian's description of his activities in his letter. In the third month, the emperor went to Mount Tai. In the fourth month, he visited Puchi. Both places are in the eastern provinces. In the fifth month, he returned to the capital and declared a general amnesty. In the 12th month, the emperor went to Yung, HS 6 upon 36a. According to this theory, if Qian wrote in the 11th month, he would be quite correct in saying that he had been busy attending the emperor on a visit to the east, and that as the last month of the year drew near, he would again be forced to go with the emperor, this time to Yung. But how are we to account for the fact that Jen An was accused of a crime at this time? Wang Kuo Wei refers to the words of Emperor Wu recorded by Chu Sao Sung, and has been guilty of a great many crimes worthy of death, but I have always let him live. In other words, Jen An had been in serious trouble at least once before his final tragic end, and this must be why Qian says, "You are now accused of this terrible crime." End of quote. It should be remembered that during the Han, and particularly in the late years of Emperor Wu's reign, officials were thrown into prison on the slightest charges. There is hardly a famous man of the age who was not at some time at least reprimanded and removed from his post. So it is not surprising that Jen An should have been accused of some crime in 93 BC. We recall that he was for a time regional inspector of I province, but later we find him back at his old job as superintendent of the northern garrison. It is quite possible that he was removed from his post in I province because of some misdemeanor, and at that time he was put in prison, but was later pardoned and restored to official position. If this supposition is true, we may reconstruct the situation as follows. In late 94 or early 93 BC, Jen An, who was then regional inspector of I province in Szechuan, wrote to Sima Qian suggesting that he use his influence to promote worthy men at court. Hence, when Pan Ku mentions the letter from Jen An, he is quite correct in calling him regional inspector of I province. But shortly after he received the letter, Sima Qian was forced to go with the emperor on a tour of the east, returning to the capital in the 5th month, after which, as he says, he was kept busy with official duties. In the 7th month, a general amnesty was declared, so it is unlikely that Jen An was in prison at this time. But sometime between the 7th and 11th months, Jen An was accused of some crime and put in prison. In the 11th month, Qian wrote to him explaining why he had not answered Jen An's letter, telling of his own misfortune. Sometime later, Jen Ann was pardoned and made superintendent of the northern garrison. This theory also helps to explain how the letter of Qian came to be preserved. If Qian had written to Jen Ann when he was in prison on charges of having aided the crown prince in his revolt, and Jen Ann was shortly after executed, it is hard to see how Qian's letter, unless he circulated copies himself, would have or could have gotten into the hands of anyone who would preserve it. Thus, although we may not agree with Wang Kyo Wei that there can be no doubt that the letter was written in 93 BC, we must admit that this theory is more convincing. If it offers no positive proof, it at least avoids the obvious difficulties and contradictions of the older theory shared by Lu Xian, Chao Shao Shang, and Shawannes. End of Appendix B, page 198. Then notes begin. Oh, goodness. Oh, so the book has actually ended. I didn't know this. Okay, we can read the notes later. Right now, I need to go. I've been sweating like anything. Okay, guys, let us see. Okay, friends, I need to go in to recover from profuse sweating and come back after a while. Oops. Friends, I'm waiting for someone of you to ask me questions. Let us see who is there online. Nobody is there online. Okay. Let's cut the live here. Stop. Okay.